We've all been wrestling with intellectual humility over the past year or so, not just as a topic of scholarly inquiry, but my guess is that many of us are also passionate about the topic for ourselves personally and for society. We're excited about intellectual humility and think it's worth studying because we regard it as a good that we would like to see more of. And I wanted to start our conference by paying tribute to our own personal struggles with humility, while also recognizing that those of us gathered here represent at least three different disciplinary perspectives: philosophy, psychology, and theology. And I believe I have found a song that does the job quite nicely. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror. I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. I must be a hell of a man. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can. I guess you could say I'm a loner, a cowboy outlaw, tough and proud. Well, I could have lots of friends if I wanna, but then I wouldn't stand out from the crowd. Well, some folks say I'm egotistical. Hell, I don't even know what that means. But I guess it has something to do with the way that I fill out my skin-tight blue jeans. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror, 'cause I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. Well, I must be a hell of a man. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can. Now maybe you find this just maybe a silly song about someone you clearly perceive as arrogant. Perhaps he is dismissive of all the signs that he's not perfect. But let's suppose I disagree. I will offer an opposing view on this song. My contention is that I see seeds of many of the presentations we're going to hear over the course of this conference in this song. So please exercise your abundant open-mindedness and indulge me. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble. This first line indicates that the song is actually a prayer about humility, a theological case study in humility, if you will. It shows a clear recognition of how elusive this virtue can be. It is hard to be humble, but why? Maybe it's hard to be humble as a consequence of a bad fit between natural evolved cognition and contemporary environment. There could be any number of neural, cognitive, and social contributions to the development of intellectual humility, or barriers in its way. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. Does an evaluation of oneself as being great necessarily run counter to humility? From the dirty, hairy view of intellectual humility, a man's got to know his limitations. A great person who is fully aware of their few weaknesses, perhaps including having difficulties with pride, may be intellectually humble. It may be, too, that being great and owning it fully actually enables one to have low sensitivity to self-exaltation and therefore act humbly. Indeed, don't the stronger and more knowledgeable occasionally humble themselves for the sake of the weaker and less knowing? Perhaps an element of perfection is the ability to humble oneself. I can't wait to look in the mirror, 'cause I get better looking each day. Surely here we have an example of a judgmental error imbued with too much confidence. Or perhaps the singer is expressing an unquenchable desire for new data and is pleased by how it forces him to revise his beliefs about himself. To know me is to love me. Well, I must be a hell of a man. Here we see a simple inference being drawn. People appear to love me instantly. Why? I must be extraordinary. A clear example of how we are dependent upon others for our ways of thinking about ourselves. If our singer truly believed in his exceptionality based upon the available evidence, wouldn't we want him to engage? We wouldn't want him to engage in mock humility or self-abasement. Rather, we would want our singer to cultivate a habit of humility. And perhaps a good place to start is by confessing one's struggle with pride. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can. Now, I'm sure we can all now agree with me that this Mac Davis song is a rich source of reflections considering the topic of our conference. And there couldn't be a better way of starting us off than me singing the chorus for you one more time. If you know it, please sing along. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror, 'cause I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. Well, I must be a hell of a man or woman. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can. Yeah, we're doing the best that we can. And for a slightly more scholarly introduction to our conference, I give you Ian Church.
Thank you, Justin. All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and welcome to the Intellectual Humility Capstone Conference. My name is Ian Church, and the very first thing I want to do is to thank the Templeton Foundation, because if it weren't for them, we couldn't be here. And thanks to their generous support, we've seen a tremendous amount of energy, interest, and excellent scholarship on intellectual humility. High-impact scholarship that has exciting real-world potential. Well, over the past 3 years, I have been very honored to work on intellectual humility, starting out on the Science of Intellectual Humility project at the Fuller Graduate School of Psychology, and then for the past 2 years, working on the Philosophy and Theology of Intellectual Humility project at St. Louis University. So now I like to bill myself as a world expert on intellectual humility. And even I've got a talk in a couple months in the United Kingdom, and the title of the talk is Intellectual Humility, What You Ignorant Half-Wits Need to Know. But this isn't the end of my humble journey. I'm very happy and excited about, I'm in a process right now. We're going to be moving to the University of Edinburgh, where I'll be taking on a post to start a MOOC on the science and philosophy and theology of intellectual humility, and taking some of the research that we've seen produced here and trying to disseminate it to thousands of students around the world. It's really exciting stuff, and it's an exciting time. There we go. Right. So over the past 3 years, I have I've been able to wrestle with these sort of questions, several big questions about intellectual humility. And as I welcome you all to the conference, I wanted to present these to you to give us something to think about as we go into the week and as we try to figure out what we're going to learn this week. And I want to note, first of all, that this is not a technical talk at all. It's going to be very briefly taking a bird's eye view of some of these big questions and just try to see if we can give us something to think about. So the first question I want to consider is, what is intellectual humility? In the discussion summary of his Big Questions Online piece, What is it to be intellectually humble?, Professor Bob Roberts aptly and seemingly prophetically noted that, quote, one of the most striking things to emerge from our discussion of intellectual humility is a lack of consensus on what humility and intellectual humility mean. And as we've all been collectively exploring what in the world intellectual humility might be, this lack of consensus hasn't gone away. We still see it all over the place. So we have a diversity of views. And I just want to briefly mention a couple of these without going into any detail. We have the low concern for status view, which we see advocated by people like Bob Roberts and Jay Woods. The owning one's limitation view, which we see advocated by people like Dennis Whitcomb, Jason Baer, Heather Baddeley, and Dan Howard Snyder. The Thomistic accounts of intellectual humility, which is advocated by several people, but Eleanor Stump and many others. And then doxastic accounts of intellectual humility, which is advocated by myself and any of the poor souls I've managed to convince. So, I think we have, there are some serious questions that we can ask about each one of these views. So a question for the low concern for status view is intellectual humility really just the opposite of intellectual arrogance? Now, as they have explored it and unpacked it, they've done so as just the opposite of intellectual arrogance. And we might wonder if there's another vice in the neighborhood that's being missed. Can't we be too humble? Isn't there another contrasting vice to take account of? And is intellectual humility better conceived as a virtuous mean? Questions for the owning one's limitations view. What about owning one's strengths? As Dennis Whitcomb and others have cashed out their account of intellectual humility, owning one's limitations is made explicitly distinct from owning one's strengths. But as such, intellectual humility might be seen as an unduly negative virtue, merely capturing what we can't do and with little concern for what we can do, what we can accomplish. And I like the caption on this, if you can't see it. It's one of my favorite demotivational posters. It says, limitations. Until you spread your wings, you'll have no idea how far you can walk. Then we have the Thomistic account of intellectual humility, developed by Eleanor Stump and others. Now, in my view, I think Eleanor's account is genuinely elegant and beautiful. I'm not just saying that because she's my boss, but it is an excellent account. And it's too bad she's not here, but if you get the opportunity, you should talk to her about it. But there's a worry that for those of us who are interested in a secular account of intellectual humility, can a Thomistic account, which draws often so heavily from our relationship to God, can it really give us a secular account? And finally, there's questions for the doxastic account, which is my own account. And I know all too well some of the worries that face it. So, for example, isn't there a social dimension to intellectual humility? Oh, by the way, so the doxastic account, which it's not as clear just by the name what it is, I'm trying to advocate that intellectual humility is the virtue of accurately tracking the positive epistemic status that's enjoyed by our beliefs. So isn't there a social dimension that this isn't capturing? How can this be measured? Is this different from rationality in general? There's all sorts of worries that face this account. And of course, I think there are plenty of questions for everybody. So how does intellectual humility interface with humility simpliciter? To what extent does intellectual humility have a social dimension? And is intellectual humility an intellectual virtue at all? Now, that leads us to our second question. What is an intellectual virtue? Now, it's easy to assume that intellectual humility is an intellectual virtue, but we all know what happens when we assume. Some questions to consider here. Why should we think intellectual humility is an intellectual virtue? And if it is, then what is an intellectual virtue anyway? And finally, and we'll talk about this more in question 5, if it is an intellectual virtue, are we the sort of critters that can have intellectual virtues? Excuse me. So early on, when I started this project, I advocated that this should have been the official beer of the project, Arrogant Bastard Ale, but I didn't get a whole lot of traction with that. So first of all, is intellectual humility really an intellectual virtue? Now we might think the answer to this is obvious, but it becomes perhaps somewhat less obvious when we consider evolutionary perspectives. After all, it might very well be the case that a little bit of intellectual arrogance can go a long way in society and in dating relationships. And I've heard of studies that we have a highly enhanced view of ourselves. We overestimate our own abilities and status, and the people who don't do that so much are people who are depressed. They have a more accurate view of their accomplishments. Insofar as we don't want to point to depression as a thriving human life or the thriving way to go, it seems like maybe a little bit of arrogance might be helpful. Or I've also heard of studies where if men have an inflated sense of how good looking they are, they're much more likely to get dates. So again, maybe it's an evolutionary virtue to be intellectually arrogant. And so can intellectual humility be an intellectual vice while being an evolutionary virtue, vice? I think I said that right. So questions to consider there. But maybe there isn't a problem with someone being something being an intellectual virtue while also being an evolutionary vice. Or maybe intellectual humility isn't really an evolutionary vice after all. Maybe our chances at success in society and at reproduction are greatly diminished if we're arrogant bastards. Character virtues. Let's see. So if intellectual humility is an intellectual virtue, then what is an intellectual virtue anyway? So one way to cash this out is in terms of character virtues. Now these, I think, might be generally recognizable to most of us. Maybe our chances that something like open-mindedness, akin to open-mindedness, or intellectual courage. But we can debate about what the goal of these intellectual virtues, these intellectual character virtues might be, whether it's knowledge, understanding, or wisdom. And then we can also ask, what are these things as well? And what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for intellectual character virtues? Another way to cash about intellectual virtues is in terms of faculty virtues. So think about a virtuous knife. Now, knives, at least my knives, don't have intellectual characters. They aren't open-minded or courageous. But they do have faculty virtues insofar as they are doing what they're supposed to do. I have a virtuous knife if it's a knife that cuts well, if it does a good job chopping. So likewise, we might be interested in intellectual virtues insofar as our intellectual faculties, typically perception, memory, etc., are functioning like they're supposed to. And of course, we should probably be interested in both ways of understanding intellectual virtue. After all, perhaps intellectual humility, depending on how we define it, is best understood as a character virtue. But it might be a character virtue that is drastically improved by the reliability, that it also drastically improves the reliability of our faculty virtues. There's a lot more to say here, but let's move on. So closely tied to how we define intellectual humility is how we go about measuring it. And this is a far from straightforward matter, because after all, it doesn't seem like we can just go and ask people if they're humble. Surely one of the reasons it's hard to be humble is you can't tell people just how humble you are. So in any case, how we define intellectual humility is going to directly affect what metrics we look for and how we aim to measure it. And this might be a bit of a sharks and the jets sort of issue, I'm realizing, right? So on the one hand, you have sharks who have philosophers who are pursuing these definitions in the abstract, trying to get the best definitions they can. But on the other hand, you have the jets who are pursuing, who are scientists, and they need a definition that's easy to measure and you can use in the lab, right? And I should add, this isn't just a turf war with intellectual humility. This is sort of a repeated phenomenon. Whenever you have a concept that's shared across multiple disciplines, you have these sort of turf wars with the same sort of song and dance about what sort of definitions are best in philosophy versus what we need in the lab. So take the doxastic account again. Some psychologists think that my view is too complex to viably empirically measure. And my response has been, properly understood to be extremely difficult to viably measure across personality types, social dynamics, and cultural contexts. Besides, our definitions shouldn't be driven by how easily they are to be measured. You can feel some of the shark and jet stuff here, right? And so does this mean I'm advocating that complex definitions are useless for empirical measures? I don't think so. Perhaps we can measure central components of a complex definition that's difficult to measure. So for example, willingness to revise beliefs in the face of disagreement might be the sort of thing that is both, one, easy enough to measure, and two, able to track intellectual humility in most cases. But I think we'd be sorely remiss if we simply conflated the full complexity of intellectual humility with the willingness to revise belief in the face of disagreement. One of the things I'm hoping that we can learn this week is I need your help to help know how to balance these desires, for the best possible definitions and for scientific use. Right. So how do we become intellectually humble? So once we have a definition of intellectual humility, and once we have a viable measure that can tell us and everyone else how humble we are, we will want to know how we became this awesome. And looking at children, this looks like it might be a very tricky matter. So those are my two eldest children, and they went into the office and they said they were pretending to be daddy. So that's roughly approximately what I look like when I'm working. So why do we think it's tricky? Well, the reason is that kids are just really weird. On the one hand, it seems like they exhibit characteristics that make them incredibly arrogant. On the other, it seems like they can also be intellectually servile and gullible. And other times, it seems like they can also be intellectually humble. It's a difficult thing to know how to make sense of what kids are talking about and or how to read them in terms of the development of intellectual humility. So let's look at kids as arrogant first. First of all, kids seem to think they know everything. They underestimate their limitations, they overestimate their strengths, and some kids even seem to know all sorts of empirical facts a priori. Now this is incredible, right? So my kids, so the picture there is a picture of scalloped potatoes. So my kids know, having never tasted scalloped potatoes, they just know that they do not like it. It is an incredible epistemic feat that they've accomplished. And it's worth noting, if I behaved this way, if I acted like I know everything, if I underestimated my limitations or overestimated my strengths even more than I already do, everyone would think I'm an arrogant jerk, even more so. Now, does this mean that we should think kids are arrogant? I don't think so. I don't think it's quite that easy. Because on the other hand, kids are gullible and maybe intellectually diffident. They'll believe just about anything. They'll believe in tooth fairies, Easter bunnies, a fat man who visits every house around the world via reindeer, who lives on the North Pole and keeps an infallible track record of everyone's moral character without getting depressed. And again, if I were to believe this sort of thing, everyone would think I'm intellectually deranged, I'm misguided, or something's gone wrong here. I'm not taking my doubts about the enterprise of how Santa does all this seriously enough, right? So maybe kids are just, does this mean kids are just intellectually vicious, both arrogant and intellectually servile or gullible? Again, I don't think so. I don't think it's that easy. That's my youngest, by the way. Because I think the kids also show us characteristics that might make them also very humble. They're quick to listen to experts and parents, and experts like parents and teachers. They rarely seem to have an axe to grind. And in some cases, they're quick to admit when they don't know something. So how do we make sense of these mixed signals in children and come up with a theory as to how they can become well-adjusted, intellectually humble adults like we all are here? I'd love to know, and I'm hoping that's something I can learn this week. Next question. What can cognition tell us about intellectual humility? Human cognition employs a wide variety of heuristics and biases. And in most cases, these heuristics and biases are quite helpful. They help us navigate a complex and dynamic world quickly and efficiently. But notoriously, they can also lead us astray. They make us overestimate our understanding of complex ideas and processes. They make us overestimate our competencies, and they make us overvalue what we already believe. And it's easy to see how these heuristics and biases could be the source of, or cause of intellectual arrogance. So we might wonder, how might such a result be mitigated? Can we do anything that might minimize any intellectual viciousness that might be caused by heuristics and biases? Additionally, we might wonder if our cognition's propensity for heuristics and biases across a wide range of cases, contexts, and situations makes our cognition less than a happy home for intellectual virtue. In other words, is human cognition incompatible with the stability and reliability needed for intellectual virtue? And when we were considering the second question earlier, we wondered, first of all, if intellectual humility is an intellectual virtue, and if it is, what are intellectual virtues anyway? And now we can ask, are intellectual virtues, as we've been describing them, the sort of things that we can actually find in people empirically? Next question, are some people born humble? So while we might wonder how intellectual humility can be developed, we might also wonder what traits and dispositions most readily afford the development of intellectual humility. To what extent are people born with a propensity for intellectual humility or intellectual arrogance? And along the same lines, are the traits and dispositions that help afford intellectual humility stable from birth? Or can they be developed and learned habits? Or are they developed and learned habits? Or are they the sort of things that are available to everyone and merely enhanced by certain situations? So many questions here, but we'll keep moving. Question number 7, how do emotions affect our ability to be intellectually humble? Now, perhaps philosophers haven't always had the best attitudes when it comes to the roles of emotions. For philosophers, the role of emotion, especially in the arena of the intellect, had a bit of a sordid history. For many of us, we saw or perhaps still see emotions as something like an agent of chaos. If left unchecked, out from under the thumb of reason, it would lead us to a person to disaster. So in Plato's charioteer analogy, for example, which is an analogy of the soul, reason is the charioteer and emotion is the wild horse. And unless the charioteer keeps a steady whip to the motion of the horse, the whole chariot, or the whole soul will be led to disaster. But now, there's a growing body of research that seems to suggest that reason and emotion are deeply intertwined. We're learning that reason is far more influenced and motivated by our emotions than we may have initially suspected. Now we might wonder if the Platonic vision of the passions being subjected to the authority of reason is difficult to sustain in light of contemporary psychological research. And presumably, intellectual humility is closely tied to the ability to remain open to new ideas and engage with others. And from our experience in the classroom, I think we can all see how emotions deeply affect intellectual humility. We've seen that if students are feeling intimidated or scared, if someone's pounding the table and really aggressive and angry in the classroom, everyone else sort of clams up. They shut up and they don't talk about it and they don't listen to new ideas. Alternatively, if students are feeling congenial and safe on a sunny island, people are much more likely to listen and to engage and to be friendly and maybe even change their minds. And this seems to be congenial for intellectual humility. That's right, let's hope. Next question, can we trust what we hear? So in most cases, it seems like if someone tells you something, you can believe them, at least in high-trust societies such as our own. And in some cases, we would seemingly be intellectually remiss if we didn't trust someone. Say if we didn't trust the testimony of experts. Say if 98% of climate scientists tell me that the humans are causing climate change, it seems like I'd be intellectually vicious to not believe them. But there are also cases where we should not trust what we hear. Perhaps in some cases, virtue precludes trust. When listening to politicians or car salesmen, at least insofar as they're trying to sell us a car, it would be an intellectual failing to just take them at their word, to just believe what they tell us without looking into it further. So how do we know who to trust and when? When does intellectual humility afford trust, and when does it afford disbelief? More things for us to consider this week. Question number 9. How should we handle disagreement? We can disagree about just about anything, especially philosophers. And from ethics to politics to religion to matters of taste, and even epistemic peers, people who are just as informed and intelligent and clever, can disagree just about over a wide range of subjects. So does intellectual humility mean giving up on our beliefs in the face of disagreement? Or are there times when we can hold on to our beliefs, even when faced with peer disagreement, and still be intellectually humble? There's several cases that might be all familiar to us. So say we all go out to dinner, and we decide to split up the check evenly. I look at the bill, do some quick math. I think I owe $25. I pass it to Justin. He looks at the bill, does some quick math. He says we owe $27. Given that neither one of us has any reason to think that either one of us is better at that basic arithmetic, it seems like the right thing to do, the virtuous thing to do, is just to take another look at the bill, to withhold belief until we can look at the bill again. But there are also cases, it seems like, where the right thing to do is to stick to your guns. So consider this case, which may not be too far from a real-world case. Jill is a philosopher working away in her office when one of her colleagues, Jack, stops to chat. Now Jill considers Jack to be her epistemic peer, and she has no reasons to suspect that Jack is in any way less intelligent, educated, or clever than herself. Nevertheless, this day, Jack surprises Jill with a shocking revelation. Jack confides in Jill that he has recently stopped believing that 2 + 2 = 4. Now, if Jill knows anything, she knows that 2 + 2 = 4. Does Jack's disagreement on this force Jill to reconsider her belief about basic arithmetic? Seemingly not. So I want to say there are cases where the right thing to do is to give up our beliefs, to withhold beliefs, and seemingly there are also cases where the right thing to do is to stick to your guns. So there are clear cases when we should withhold belief, clear cases when we should stick to our guns. And unfortunately, a lot of cases are not nearly so neat. It's not at all clear, for example, what we should do when we disagree about politics, ethics, and as we'll talk about just now, religion. So what is the intellectually humble thing to do in those cases? Excellent. And so speaking of disagreements, religious disagreements are among the worst. So this is my favorite GIF that represents represents religious disagreements, especially on the internet. Right? So we can ask the question, what does intellectual humility tell us about religion? But we can also flip that around. We can ask, what can religion tell us about intellectual humility? And at St. Louis University, we've had some excellent conferences or a conference on the intellectual humility in the Jewish and Muslim traditions. And the videos of those talks are still online on our website. And I know many of our awardees from the Phase 2 are exploring the intellectual humility from the Christian worldview or Christian tradition. And we can also ask, can various theological perspectives speak to some of the other big questions we've been considering so far? So can we have a theologically driven definitions of intellectual humility? A theological perspective on how to handle disagreement? A theology of how we become intellectually humble, etc. And so in asking earlier, is intellectual humility ever compatible with dogmatism? I wanted to suggest there might be cases where intellectual humility is compatible with dogmatism. And a natural next question is, if so, are there religious beliefs that we can be dogmatic about? And of course, that's going to be a tricky question. It seems like there might be cases where it's conceptually possible to say you can be dogmatic about your religious beliefs, but knowing when you're ever in a situation like that, and for what beliefs, that's going to be a very tricky business that I hope we can try to figure out something about it this week. So in conclusion, I think we have a lot to think about, and over the past 3 years, I've been delighted to have a job where I get to wrestle with some of these big questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing your big answers. Thank you very much.